Alright guys, so before we venture into the world of watercolor, the first thing we need to talk about is your canvas, or in our case, paper. You can see from the paper I've given you, it's a little bit different than what you would normally use. It's textured. So the texture is actually what helps to hold the watercolor and keep it from soaking up. This one that I'm showing you now is a notepad that I have that is actually textured on one side and smooth on the back side. So if you ever buy your own watercolor paper, do try to pay attention to which side is more textured because that is the front. I do believe the one that I provided you with is equally as textured on both sides, so you really don't need to worry about a right and a wrong side. If you run out of some of the watercolor paper that I gave you, please let me know and I will get you some more. You will not have a good time trying to paint on any other type of paper. It will soak through way too fast and your colors will be dulled and muted. So today we are going to practice a series of watercolor techniques as well as experiment with values and colors. So the first thing you guys will want to do is prep your paper. You have two different sizes that I gave you. We will be working on the larger of the two sizes, the 9 by 12. And from what you can see here, I've divided my page up actually using masking tape. This is something you can do, although it's not required. I know we probably don't all have masking tape at home, but if you do have it or if you're at school, you're welcome to use the tape. It gives just really nice clean lines in between these technique sections that we're going to be using. If you don't have masking tape, you're more than welcome to simply divide your paper up using your pencil. So what you'll need are 8 different sections for the different techniques, as well as 4 sections where we're going to invent our own colors, and then leave a larger section, and that's where we will practice value scales. So if you divide your paper up something kind of like what you see here, then you're good to go. But as always, feel free to get creative and take artistic liberties. The next thing I want to talk about is the prepping of your paint and then the paint application itself. So watercolor is extremely different from any other paints that we would normally have used. So acrylic, oils, and temperas are very standard paints. Watercolor is different because it relies on water to be used. So one thing that I want to nip in the bud right now is how to get your paints ready. Oftentimes, one of the very common errors is that students, primarily younger students, will try to actually dig this color out of the palettes. But really what you're trying to do is get this puddle. You're really not painting with the paint you see so much here, but rather the colored water that you're creating. So to start, I am going to encourage you to practice by getting some colors ready on the back of your paint tray or the palette that you were given, rather than painting directly from the colored cakes. Those of you with tubed watercolor, this is going to be a little bit different. Basically, what you'll need to do is squeeze out a little bit of paint, whatever color you would like to use, onto your palette. And you can either allow that paint to dry to the point that it is very similar to these paint trays. And then what you would do is, again, wake it up with the water and it'll act very similarly to this. Or what you can do is squeeze out a little bit and use it while it's still wet, but be wary, again, not to just scoop up the paint and paint with it without any addition of water. You really need to add the water to give it that watercolor effect. The tubes also allow you to keep your paints pretty clean. I'll talk about this now and I will mention it again and throughout the class, but I'm really going to encourage the creation of your own colors. I'd really like us to avoid using colors straight from the cakes or from the tubes. To me, it's a little bit primitive, it's a little elementary. Your paintings will end up looking way more sophisticated and more original if you create your own colors. This is another reason why it's nice to get your paints prepped out, because you don't have to worry about trying to mix the same ratios if you need to use a large amount of your own unique color. The first technique that we'll be trying, which is also the most basic technique, is called a wash. A wash is pretty much just a flat, solid color all the way across. So simply enough, I am just getting my paintbrush filled with my color, and I am just making these smooth strokes all the way across my first section. Because I have some puddling that is making my wash uneven, I can go back in with my brush and try to smooth it out. However, it's very important that with watercolor, you don't work the paint too much. If you start to use your brush on your page too often, the paper will start to crumble. With watercolor, you really need to learn how to just make your mark and then leave it be. At least until it dries, that is. The next technique is called a gradient. A gradient is going from light to dark with a gradual transition. What I'm doing here is starting with a nice dark pigmented bit of paint, and then all I do is go back into my water, wash the paint off, and continue to drag that pigment down. I'm only going into my paint palette for that first mark. Afterwards, I'm only painting with water. You do need to try to do this relatively quickly because you don't want the paint that you put down to dry before you have the chance to spread it downwards. Also, avoid the temptation to touch up that dark part. If you go back in with it once it's down, your paintbrush will probably pull the pigment up and it won't be as dark, or you'll have splotches. Next you have variegated. All this means is that you're using multiple colors. I'm going to start this the same way that I did my gradient. However, instead of emptying my brush and only going back in with water, I'm going to fill my brush with a different color. You only need to try a minimum of 2 colors for this, but you're welcome to try more. Again, the key is to keep the painting wet so that where these colors meet is a smooth blend. The nice thing about watercolor is that if it doesn't look smooth now, it will start to blend together as the paint dries. I also want to use my own negligence as a word of caution. If you can see that this square looks a little bit texturized, you can see some dark speckles, that's because I actually painted into this square, wiped it up, and didn't allow it to dry before I went back in with this technique. So the paper got overworked and it started to fall apart. Technique number 4 is one of my favorites. It's really fun and it looks really cool. Wet on wet is just as it sounds. What you need to do is actually wet your paper with a coat of water beforehand. My water's a little bit dirty, so if you don't want any leftover color showing up, then make sure you're using clean water. So I'm using enough so that it doesn't dry right away, but not too much so that I have a pool going on in my paper. You may need to experiment with the amount of water you put down. Next thing you do is grab the color that you want to use, and really all you need to do is just touch that pigment to the pool of water that you've created. If you're lucky, it will start to spread out really fast, but either way you still get a really cool effect, and the paint continues to spread for quite a while, so what you see at first might not be what it looks like at the very end once it's dry. Wet on wet is nice because you allow the paint to do its own thing. You control it a little bit, but really, the paint decides where it wants to go and what it wants to spread with. Watch carefully as this blue starts to bleed out really nicely. With this technique, try to use several different colors to see what they do and how they react with one another. By the way, if you've used masking tape to separate your sections, this is less of a problem, but if you're just using pencil, be careful not to paint next to a piece of paper that's already wet if you don't intend for them to mix. So for this technique assignment, you may want to jump around different sections of your paper to allow other sections to dry before painting next to it. Technique number 5 is called blotting. We've already used a wash, and this is how I'm going to start for this technique. I'm going to choose a dark color just because I think it'll show up better for you guys. But what I'm doing is just layering down a solid wash of this blue-purple, and I don't want it to be soaking wet, but I do want it to have a good amount of moisture in it. From here, what I'm doing is taking this textured paper towel and blotting it. And what will happen is the more raised area of that paper towel will pick up some of the paint and some of the pigment, leaving this nice pattern behind. What you can also do is simply crumple up your paper towel or a piece of tissue and blot it down onto your paint, and it will still give you a cool effect. You can kind of see it happening here on the excess red on top of the tape. Here's a little bit of a better shot of the crumpled paper towel blotting up some of the blue from my wet on wet. Hopefully I've been keeping accurate count of these techniques. You may have noticed that I prepped a section of red before showing you blotting. What I want to talk about now is the importance of layering your paints. As I think I mentioned, watercolor paints tend to dry lighter than when you put them down. So we really need to work on creating those value differences. And to do so, you need to allow bottom layers of your paint to dry before painting a second layer on top. You can see I've already layered on some red, and it's very easy to tell how much darker the overall color became just by adding those layers. You can see I'm also using this opportunity to layer it with green. So just because we're trying to create value changes of red doesn't mean we can't do so with different hues. With layering, you're not very likely to get that smooth gradient, so don't overwork your paper trying to do that. Just embrace the painterly quality that comes naturally with layering. Over top of your layering, again, once it's dry, you can also experiment with making finer lines. So this is something that should be saved for some sort of last step or final detail. I'm also including this video to demonstrate why layering is important as opposed to going in really thick with your paint. Paint that is too thick will develop this reflective shine once it is dry, and that is something that we should avoid. Spritzing is another pretty fun technique. I'm actually not sure if this is the correct term, but I think it makes sense. And I don't know if there is a correct term, so that's what I'm going to call it. For this one, I'm using an alternative brush, one that has a little bit more bounce to it. If you don't have any more paintbrushes, your toothbrush will actually work very well. Don't worry, we won't get paint on it, but you might want to get a clean cup of water. Once again, I'm going to create and select a color and put down a relatively wet wash on my next section. I do want this to be a little bit on the darker side. Again, this is for me to make sure that you guys can see it. It will probably also work with a lighter color if that's what you prefer for yours. Once I'm satisfied with this wash, I will take my springier paintbrush or my toothbrush and I will fill it with water, not dripping, but enough, and I will spritz it or fling water onto that wet watercolor. And you can already see it's starting to develop this really cool splotchy look. Again, it will probably continue to change until the paper dries. The last technique that we will try before working on our value scales is called sgraffito. This is also commonly done in ceramics. Sgraffito is an Italian word meaning to scratch. So what I can be seen doing here is scratching into my paper. To get those scratches, I recommend using the end of a paper clip or even some sort of push pin if you have it. Try to actually scratch the surface of the paper instead of simply creating an impression. You want to hear that paper tear. Quick disclaimer, you don't want the paper to actually get cut, just tear the surface. Now, as I begin to paint over those scratches, The pigment will fill in those little torn areas and create darker details. You'll get better results if that paper tore. If you just made an impression, it won't be as dark. This technique is great for fine details. Now that we've practiced different ways to apply paint, we need to practice creating value. I am going to annoy you to no end if I don't see value changes in your paintings, which is why we're going to start practicing now. We're going to be making value scales, but they're more value forms. What I'd like you to do is create 3 circle-ish shapes on that large section of paper. To practice value, we're going to try to turn these circles from 2-dimensional shapes to 3-dimensional forms. And to do that, we're going to pretend there's a light source coming from the top corner. I'm going to move my brush with the shape of the circle using the darkest form of yellow that I can, meaning with a small amount of water. And as I continue up to the corner, I'm going to use more and more water. Don't go back into your paint trays. Just slowly start to remove pigment by dipping your brush into your water. Dab it off if needed to get any excess water off. The challenge here is going to be trying to create the darkest tone of yellow, which means what? Yep, I need to go back in and layer once it's dry. Notice that I didn't put anything in the very top corner, which is where the lightest value should be. When using watercolor, the white of the paper is going to be your highlights. Even if you have white watercolor, do not try to use it as a pure white. For whatever reason, it just doesn't look right. It usually ends up looking muddy, and your best bet is to just plan ahead and leave your paper plain for those highlights that you want. So as you can see, I'm going to have you do this 3 times. I want you to use a light color, a medium color, and a dark color. So for me, I'm choosing yellow, red, and I'm actually going to use black. And the reason I'm using black is to show you how dark it gets. So with yellow, my challenge is going to be creating very dark darks, but with black, the challenge is going to be creating lighter lights. I also just want to pause here again to show you that I'm really only using heavy pigment along the outermost part of this form. After having about this much down, I am putting my brush in the water to remove some pigment. So I'm using more water, less pigment as I go. These value transitions do not need to be smooth, but I need to be able to see a dark value, a mid-tone value, and a light value. And once again, as I use black, this very powerful, overwhelming color, I might even want to just do this much and then start to get the paint off of my brush. And as I've mentioned, once these are dry, I'm going to go back into my yellow and probably even my reds and layer to create a darker value. Color mixing. Like I mentioned before, I really want us to get into the habit of making our own colors, and this even includes making our own grays and blacks. In order to make a black, all you need to do is mix 2 complementary colors. From my experience, purple and yellow work the best. Although if you were trying to make a very dark dark for something that is red toned, you might want to use red and green because that black will have the red tint. But here, I'm just going to start by showing you how purple and yellow come together to create a black. As part of your color mixing experiment, I do want you to try creating your own black, whether it's purple and yellow, red and green, or orange and blue. You might need to mess around a little bit with the ratios until you're satisfied with the outcome. This may look a little bit on the purple side now, but as it dries, it becomes surprisingly gray. You can even see it compared to the purple right above it. Also, a word of caution, Don't be disappointed if you try mixing orange and blue or red and green and you end up with more of a brown. For the remainder of these sections, I do want you to work on just creating your own colors. Mix 2 colors, mix 3, mix 4. I don't care how many, just come up with something that is not already in your tray. You can mix them on your palette beforehand, or you can try mixing colors directly on your paper, like what I did with the blue and yellow to create the green. Just be cautious not to overwork your paper. Here I'm even trying to mix blue directly onto my orange to create a darker orange tone. And with a little bit of finagling, I do kind of achieve it. And the last thing you'll see me do in this video is go back in and layer the darkest sections of my value spheres. If I really wanted these to be dark, I can go in, create my black, just like with this yellow, but for the sake of this experiment, I'm happy with just a couple of layers. And the last thing you can do is the grand reveal. Carefully peel off your tape and you're left with nice, clean sections. Oops, you can see where I messed up my gradient and pasted down a new piece of paper. Whether or not you used masking tape, I do want you to label each of the techniques that you did, since your paper will probably be laid out differently than mine. Once you're finished labeling and you're happy with what you have, please take a photo and submit it.